Okay, so there are various methods you could use to solve this equation, but one method in particular is the easiest method, and it's the one that you should use. But let's see if some of you out there can still solve this equation, but you might use a hard or a harder method, more difficult method, one that involves more steps. But in mathematics, what you want to do always is to try to work and solve problems in their most efficient manner. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and see if you can actually just solve the equation for x. And the equation here is 2x times 4x plus 5, and this is equal to 0. So if you can solve this equation using any technique, go ahead and put your answer into the comment section. I'll share the correct answer in just 1 second. Then, of course, I'm going to solve this problem using the easiest approach. And we'll take a look at a common way that some students might take, which is a more involved or a harder approach to solve this equation. But before we get started, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is John, and I have been teaching middle and high school math for decades. And it really is my true passion to try to make learning math as easy as possible. So if you need assistance in mathematics, check out my math help program at tcmathacademy.com. You can find a link to that in the description below. And if this video helps you out, or if you just enjoy this content, make sure to like and subscribe, as that definitely helps me out. Okay, so 2x times 4x plus 5 is equal to 0. What is the solution? What is x equal to? Well, x is actually equal to two values. X is equal to 0 and x is equal to negative 5 over 4. Okay, now if you got this right, we have to celebrate by giving a nice little happy face and A plus, a 100%, and multiple stars. So you can brag to your friends and family that indeed you are an expert, a professional in solving very basic quadratic equations. And that's what we're dealing with here. This is a quadratic equation. Now, on the surface, you may not recognize it as a quadratic equation. Now, if you have some experience in algebra, or if you've taken a year or two of algebra, you should see that this is indeed a quadratic equation. But what is a quadratic equation? Some of you might be saying, hey, Mr. YouTube Math Man, I'm totally lost here. Well, let's go ahead and get into the solution. And first things first, let's just talk about this quadratic equation business, okay? So what is a quadratic equation? Well, a quadratic equation, by definition, is what we call a second degree polynomial. Now, that sounds kind of fancy, but let me kind of go up here real quick and show you what a second degree polynomial looks like. Now, first of all, we need to understand what is a polynomial. Now, a polynomial, okay, let's just use a variable like x. So we can have, there's all different sorts of types of polynomials. And polynomials are a huge part of algebra because we know so much about polynomials and they're very easy to work with. We have a lot of kind of laws and properties that we understand about polynomials. So let's just take a look at a quick definition of what a polynomial is. Okay, so let's take a variable like x. You can have two variables like x, y, and still have a polynomial, but the building blocks, kind of like the DNA of a polynomial, starts with something called a term, a polynomial term. So we'll use a variable like x. Okay, so here we have x. Now, there's two parts of a polynomial term. There is the exponent part. Okay, we could put a value up here in the exponent, and then we could put a number in front of our variable. That's called a coefficient. Let's start with this number that we can put in front of the variable. Again, that's called a coefficient. This could be any real number. So anything on the real number line. So here's 0, here's all the positive numbers, here's all the negative numbers. We can have negative decimals, positive fractions. Doesn't make a difference as long as the number, excuse me, is a real number. We are okay. So in other words, we can have like negative 1.3, 2/3, 8. Doesn't make a difference. Okay. So that is the coefficient. Let's just put something in here for the time being, like 7. All right, now the part of the polynomial where you really have to pay attention, or the definition of polynomial, is the power, the exponents, okay? So the exponents can be a positive integer or 0. So that would be technically what we call the whole numbers. So that would be 0, 1, 2, 3. We can't have any negative numbers. So in other words, if I had 7x to the negative 3 power, this is not a polynomial because the exponent here is a -3. This is something else. Okay, and certainly if I have a fraction, that's not a polynomial. It has to be a positive integer or 0. So these are the conditions or the building blocks, if you will, of a polynomial. Now, we can string together all sorts of polynomials. So something like this, 2x, this would be called, or we would describe this type of polynomial as a monomial because it's all by itself. If we have 2x plus 1, this is called a binomial. It's still a polynomial, but it has a special kind of term or description, a binomial or name. And then we can have something like this, 2x squared plus 3x plus 7. This is called a trinomial. And it is a polynomial, but it's a trinomial because there's three terms. One term, here, these are two terms. And then even numbers, okay, you might be saying, hey, Mr. YouTube Math Man, that's not a term. Well, yes, indeed, a number. Let's use the like number 5. 5 is the same thing as like 5x to the 0 power. Anything to the 0 power is 1. So indeed, numbers are considered terms of a polynomial. So this would be a trinomial. There's three terms here, but the key thing that I want to kind of talk about is that the highest power here, what we call the degree, is the highest power of the polynomial is 2. Okay, so when you have a polynomial and the highest power is 2, we would call this a second degree polynomial. And if we have this as an equation, this by definition is a quadratic equation. Now, I kind of went through this. A lot of you are like, boy, Mr. YouTube Math Man, you're over explaining this. Well, I know most of you out there, recognize a quadratic equation when you see one, but probably a lot of you could not kind of summarize everything I just stated there, okay, specifically. So these things matter because as you progress in mathematics, you need to understand the strict, precise definition of things like a polynomial or a rational expression or a radical expression or exponential expression, etc., etc. Okay, so let's get back to this now. Now that we have a complete understanding of what a quadratic equation is, let's talk about some of the characteristics of what we need to be thinking about when we solve a quadratic equation. All right, so here are some properties. The first thing is there are always two solutions to a quadratic equation. Now I'm going to kind of go back up here real quick and talk about something super, super fast. So let's say I have 4x squared plus 5x plus 1 is equal to 0. We have this thing called the fundamental theorem of algebra. This is very important. And it says if you have a polynomial equation, the number of solutions this polynomial will have will be equal to the degree of the polynomial. So if we have a quadratic equation that is a second degree polynomial, therefore you'll have two solutions. But this also plays in situations where you have higher order polynomials. In other words, if I have 4x to the fifth plus 5x squared, what's the highest power of this polynomial? And again, this is a polynomial equation. Well, this is a fifth degree polynomial indicating there are 5 solutions. Now, what type of solutions can we have? Well, you can have both real number or imaginary complex number solutions. And again, there's a lot to kind of cover here, but the bottom line is you will have two solutions. All right, now let's talk about some other attributes of a quadratic equation. So what methods do we have? Now, I stated in the beginning of this video that you can use different methods to solve this equation. Now, sometimes what you can do is you can take the square root of both sides to solve quadratic equations. Sometimes you can factor. You can always use the quadratic formula to solve any quadratic equation. And if you don't know what the quadratic formula is, I'm going to actually show you this in just a minute or two. And then there's something called completing the square, which is kind of like the long version of the quadratic formula. And all of you out there that are studying any sort of algebra need to know all this stuff that I'm talking about. You will have to be able to solve quadratic equations using these various techniques. Now, one thing you should know is that a quadratic function or a quadratic equation, the graph of all quadratic equations is something called a parabola. It's basically a U-shaped graph like so. And visually, we can determine the solutions to a quadratic equation if we have the graph to that polynomial, okay, or that quadratic equation. Let me show you this real fast. And this is going to be a very good review for some of you out there that are not familiar with this. So let's say I have x, y here. And let's suppose I have some quadratic equation. And when I go to graph it using my graphing calculator or other techniques just by hand, let's suppose this is the graph of that quadratic equation. Well, where the graph happens to cross the x-axis, these points here are in fact the real number solutions. So let's suppose this is x is equal to, let's say 6, and this might be like x is equal to -2. Well, these here, these x-intercepts, are the real number solutions to this polynomial or this second degree polynomial equation, i.e. a quadratic equation. But not all quadratic equations, when you graph them, are going to go through the x-axis. They might go like this. Okay, you're like, well, yay, this thing doesn't cross the x-axis. Where are the solutions to this quadratic equation? Of course, this is the graph of that whatever quadratic equation. Well, in this particular case, this situation, you would have imaginary roots or complex imaginary number solutions. So obviously I'm getting into a lot here. I'm going to give you some follow-on suggestions if you're like, okay, I don't even know where this is like, too much information. Well, listen, one step at a time. Okay, but we just need to have our bearings here about quadratic equations. It's a huge, very important topic in algebra. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this right now. And let's take a harder approach, okay? Now, and some students, they'll see this expression, they'll see a value, a term outside of another term, and they might say, you know what, I know how to multiply a monomial times a binomial. In other words, you know how to multiply two polynomials together, and that's great. So you might feel the kind of impulse to be like, all right, I'm just going to multiply these together. I think that's a good first step. Now, if you do that, what we're going to have is this, 2x times 4x is 8x squared, so that's correct, and then 2x times 5 is 10x. So this is an illustration of the distributive property, no problem here. So what we have now is 8x squared plus 10x is equal to 0, and how can we solve this quadratic equation? Well, when you learn about quadratic equations, there's something called standard form, and if you're familiar with working with the quadratic formula, you have to get your quadratic equation into standard form, which is basically get it into everything on one side of the equation equal to 0. Of course, right here we have that. But we want to write this from highest to lowest power. Okay, so we have our x squared first, then x, and then sometimes we have a number. But in this particular case, we don't have a number. We just have x squared and x term. So we'll have to put in a 0 as our number. In other words, this right here is really 8x squared plus 10x plus 0 is equal to 0. There is no number, but we need that 0 right here because we need to assign what we call A, B, C values for the quadratic formula. So A is the coefficient of the x squared term, so that's going to be 8. B is the coefficient of the middle term, so that'll be 10, and C is just whatever number value here. And if we don't have anything like a 5 or a 7, well, C will be equal to 0. All right, so now that I have my A, B, and C values, what I can do is plug these into this thing right here, and this is the world famous quadratic formula. Absolutely critical, must-know formula, and I mean, you have to know how to use it to solve quadratic equations, okay? Now, I can plug in these values, these A, B, and C values into this because here we have minus B plus or minus B squared times 4 times A times C all over 2A. So if I plug in these respective values, these A, B, C values right here, and then I simplify the remaining numeric expression, I will solve the problem, okay? But this is the hard way to do this problem, okay? So some of you may have to use the quadratic formula, but it's not the path to go, and there's even other techniques you could have done as well. But there's one technique, one method that is the easiest approach, and of course I'm going to show you that right now, but first I'm going to show you this, which is an invitation for you to hit that subscribe button. I need your support. I wouldn't stop our lovely math video here if this wasn't that important, okay? For me to make these videos, I put a lot of time and effort into it because I just love teaching mathematics. It does me no good to have learned all this math through decades and decades and teach if I, can only share this with a small group of people. But if I have a platform like YouTube to reach as many people as possible that can benefit from my math instruction, well, that's the whole idea behind me doing these videos. So I need your help to grow my channel and reach people that can benefit from my instruction. The key, really the thing that drives me the most is to stop people from ever giving up on math. So many people out there are like, I'm bad at math, I hate math, because they just don't understand. Okay, people get frustrated, and you can tell even when my discussion here about quadratic equations, there is a lot to know. Okay, in math, so there are no shortcuts. And I think people just get frustrated by maybe they're not getting the right comprehensive instruction, or they're just kind of going through school, or maybe they never, really had the right, teachers. Unfortunately, some of you could have teachers that may not really, just not inspiring you to learn math. What I'm trying to do is teach this stuff in a clear and understandable way so you do not have to look like this, okay, when it comes to mathematics. You can learn math, never give up in math. You need two things. One, you never can you have to first recognize there are no shortcuts. So you got to be willing to work. And that it goes to anything good in life. You have to work to learn algebra, mathematics. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you need comprehensive instruction, not quick little tutorials. So if you really want to learn algebra, you really want to learn this stuff, check out all my main full courses. You'll find the links to those courses in the description. But anyways, thanks for letting me kind of explain why I do these videos. Now let's get back to this problem and talk about the easy way to do this. And the easy way is something called the zero product property. Now let's go way back up here to our different methods. And we always want to try to factor a quadratic equation, because if we can factor a quadratic equation, we can use this technique called the zero product property. Now, this particular quadratic equation is already factored. That's why when you have things that are factored, you don't want to multiply them together. There's only one circumstance when you need to multiply, and that is if this thing was not equal to zero. So here we have the factors. Okay, in other words, this thing right here being multiplied by this thing is equal to zero. This is an awesome situation. Now, if the situation was 2x times 4x plus 5 is equal to 7, if this was our equation, then you have to multiply this together, get the 7 over to the other side, and put this thing into standard form, set it equal to 0, and then we can kind of go from there. It's possible that you may have a trinomial that could be factored, but nevertheless, you always want to think about factoring. Okay, so in this case, we already have factors, and this is equal to 0. So this is like the perfect situation to use something called the zero product property. Okay, now let me just state that again. Zero product. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're multiplying something, and the answer is going to be like 0. So in other words, multiplying this thing times this thing, and the answer is 0. So if I tell you, hey, I'm going to multiply two numbers together, and the answer is 0, what does that tell you about the numbers? Okay, well, that tells you that one or both of those things, those numbers, one of them has to be 0, because you can't multiply two things together and get 0 as an answer unless one or both of those values are in fact 0. So we're going to use this situation to our advantage. And again, this is what we call the zero product property. So we know that, okay, this thing times this thing is 0, so this has to either be equal to 0 or this has to be equal to 0. So we're going to take each one of these factors and set them equal to 0 and solve for x. So this is how you solve using the zero product property. It is a very, very common, easy method, and you use this not only with quadratic equations, but with more advanced polynomial equations as well. All right, so let's go and take each factor here. 4x plus 5, we'll set that equal to 0, and 2x, we'll set that factor equal to 0, and then we're going to solve these respective values for x. Let's go and do that right now. So 4x plus 5 is equal to 0, so we're going to subtract 5 from both sides of the equation. We got 4x is equal to negative 5, and then all we have to do here is divide both sides of the equation by 4. So x is equal to negative 5 over 4, and here 2x is equal to 0. To solve this equation, pretty straightforward stuff. All we're going to do is to divide both sides of the equation by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1 or 1x, and 0 divided by 2 is 0, so x is equal to 0. And look here, we have two unique solutions, okay? And this kind of fits what we were discussing, that, hey, we always will have two solutions when it comes to quadratic equations, and here they are. Okay, so this is definitely the easiest approach, but in order to really know how to solve and master quadratic equations, you need to understand all these concepts and all these methods. And when you look at a problem, you need to kind of size it up and be like, okay, what's my options? What are some techniques? Because if you can't factor, okay, you're like, well, I tried to factor, I just can't factor, no problem. Then we have to go to the quadratic formula, okay? And of course, this is a big topic, and I'm not covering everything because it would just make this video longer than it already is. But if you are at this level of mathematics, or if you want to learn this level of mathematics, you got to immerse yourself, okay? So, I think, again, where students get in trouble is they only get like a surface level amount of knowledge, with the topic. And they think they understand it better than they actually do. They're like, oh, yeah, quadratic equations, you just do this, this, and that, and I'm done. Well, no, if you're only going to try to rush through math at a surface level, that's going to get you in trouble, especially if you're going to be progressing into higher, more advanced math. So take the time, find a teacher, or get into a course that really teaches you these concepts in a comprehensive manner. And if you don't have a course, or if you're not in a course, or if you don't have a teacher that does that, well, then, hey, use my material because it is extremely comprehensive. Okay, so with all that being said, I definitely wish you all the best in your mathematics adventures. Thank you for your time and have a great day.